Yes, welcome everyone. Thanks for coming on this Friday afternoon, almost Friday afternoon. Maybe I'm wishful thinking there. I will try and keep the energy up so we can all get something useful out of this because I know it's not easy on a Friday to pay attention. But as Sam said, questions welcome throughout. And yeah, I think when I was counting earlier, I got up to about 25 different countries that I've been involved in medical device regulations in. So if there's any other countries that I don't mention, please do shout out about them and I'll see what I can answer. So I'm Daniel Mannion. I'm the Director of Professional Services and the Head of Quality and Regulatory at Eightfold Governance. Eightfold Governance is a professional services company that supports organizations with all sorts of different compliance and governance requirements, including medical device regulations. And I've spent about the last 6 years working in vitro diagnostics and software as a medical device regulation and regulatory affairs and quality assurance. So we've covered that already. So today I'm going to talk about some of the international organizations that are involved in medical devices, what their roles are, how sort of alignment across different territories is worked on, and how much progress there has been made in that. Um, I'm going to talk about the kinds of things that are commonly different between territories in their medical device regulations. So even if we don't touch on a specific country, you can look for the kinds of things to watch out for in that country that might catch you out if you were going from the UK or the EU or the US into those territories. Um, I'm going to talk about the regulations in the EU and the regulations in the US and the sort of two not opposing but different frameworks that the EU and the US have in terms of medical device regulations. And then I'm going to cover a number of countries that I believe were requested. So Switzerland, Canada, Australia, and Singapore, and then share some top tips at the end about what kind of things to look out for when looking at new territories for a medical device. But first, I thought we'd start with a little quiz about some international medical device organizations. So there's a question about have you heard of some of them and do you know what they do? And there's a list of different. Emily, is there a way to make those multi-choice instead of single-choice questions?
Yep, just give me 1 second.
Everyone's had some thinking time there.
Everyone's had some thinking time.
Or
yeah.
some Googling time.
There we go. So
That
which of these have you heard of? And if you know what they do, tick them as well on the second question. I'll just leave that up on the screen for a couple of minutes. In fact, I won't wait for a couple of minutes. I'll leave it up on the screen for like 10 to 15 seconds before I move on, because otherwise it will be a bit boring. Okay. Emily, have we got some answers on them?
Yeah.
Oh, have we got a lot of people? Oh, there we are. Brilliant. Oh, okay. So BSI, ISO, brilliant. And then the IMDRF, the IAF, the IEC. Yeah. Okay. Fab. Interesting. So I'm going to talk about what all of those organizations are now. I will obviously keep it quite quick on BSI and ISO if everyone already heard of them. But there are some other organizations involved as well. So the IMDRF is the International Medical Device Regulators Forum. It's an organization that's made up of only regulatory agencies. So its predecessor was the GHTF, which was made up of industry and regulators. And the regulators decided that they didn't like having the industry bodies involved, so they kicked them all out and started a new organization called the IMDRF. Their role is to attempt to ensure alignment between medical device regulators in different regions. And I'd say they do a moderate job, although anyone who moves into a territory outside of their home territory will find out quite how good that is. They have 12 members, 12 core members, and 25 affiliate members. The 12 members include the UK, the EU, the US, Canada, Brazil, Australia, Japan, China, Russia. I'll have missed a couple there. Singapore. And the idea is that by gathering multiple medical device regulators together to work in working groups to draft documents that can be adopted. You cannot see my screen. Did my screen share stop when we put the quiz up? Is that what's wrong?
No, I think you're okay. That might be a
Oh.
specific problem for that person.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, no, I've lost it. It's gone.
Okay, I'll share it again. Can everyone see that now?
That's back, yeah.
Okay, fantastic. The idea is that by putting specialists from each regulator into working groups, they can come up with some cross-territory agreement that might be adopted. So one of the most visible aspects of that is there is an IMDRF framework for software medical device risk classification. The EU partially adopted it in terms of which software medical devices are class 1, class 2, class 3, class 1, class 2, class 2A, 2B, or 3. The EU partially adopted it. The UK have said we will adopt it. India have adopted it. Canada have adopted it. There are quite a few international regulators that have adopted that framework because they all agreed with it. The US have not adopted it. The US doesn't tend to adopt very much from an international perspective. So there is this subset of the IMDRF called the Medical Device Single Audit Program. And the idea is that if you can be audited by a single organization rather than having to be audited by an organization representing each country, it saves time and effort for all of those countries. They don't have to not all regulators have to send an auditor to you to check up on you because you have a single audit happening. It's similar to the way that it works in pharmaceuticals. So countries will set up mutual recognition agreements to say if you've audited, if the MHRA have audited you, the FDA are happy with you as a pharmaceutical manufacturer. Well, this is the equivalent for medical devices. There are 5 countries who are currently participating in this. It's the US, Canada, Australia, Brazil, and Japan. So you can have a single management system audit that's accepted by all 5 regulators, and you only have to pay for it once rather than having it done 5 different times. And they also, if you have a surprise visit by one of those audit organizations, by one of those regulators, the other regulators will consider that equivalent to them also having surprise audited you. So it's commonly phrased MDSAP, Medical Device Single Audit Program. It's similar to an ISO 13485 audit. And you can, if you were getting MDSAP, you would be well advised to also get ISO 13485 certification at the same time. So most certification bodies will say you get both. There's not generally a way to just do MDSAP. So you'll have a single audit once a year that covers MDSAP and ISO 13485, but the requirements are not exactly the same. For example, what the US has done, what they announced in 2024 and comes into effect in 2026, is that the requirements for a quality management system are you must follow ISO 13485 plus a couple of extra bits that they've added in. And they call that the Quality Management System Regulation, the QMSR. Canada, Australia, Japan, and Brazil have done the exact same thing or very similar things. They've said roughly you must follow ISO 13485 plus a couple of extra bits that we've added in. And the auditors are going to come in and check ISO 13485 plus the extra bits that are required for those countries. The audit cycle for the medical device single audit program is similar to 13485 in that you get certified 1 year, you have 2 surveillance visits, and then that cycle repeats every 3 years as well.
Sorry, Daniel, there's a question from Kevin.
Yeah.
Kevin, is your question, is that process more expensive?
Yes. Sorry, yes, it is. It is. It varies. So you pick which country's requirements you want to add to ISO 13485, and then they charge you. They take extra days or portions of days per country that you've incorporated. But yes, generally it's for the because I don't know if you know, but if you're ISO 13485 audited, they determine the amount of time that they spend and therefore the amount of money that you pay based on the number of employees the cost per day, the number of days per employee is slightly higher for MDSAP, and it goes up for each of the 5 countries that you want to be audited against. So yeah, it is more expensive than just 13485.
Just a question on that. So what are the extra, or briefly, what are the extra bits over 13485? Is that the extra quality management system that you mentioned?
Yeah, it's extra bits on the quality management system. So all of them say that, so in a normal 13485 certification audit, they will look at examples of your registration with a regulator. In an MDSAP audit, they will check your registration with the FDA. They will check your registration with Health Canada. They will check your registration with the TGA in Australia. They will specifically check your registration is completely correct for each of those regulators, and that you have processes not just for reportable events, but for reportable events to the FDA, reportable events to the Health Canada, reportable events to the TGA. So they will take into account a lot more of the guidance from specific regulators as part of the audit. And then one of the examples, if I'm remembering correctly, from the US is requirements around complaint handling. So the FDA say you must, and again, this is just an example, but this is one to consider in terms of MDSAP. If someone makes a complaint about your product and then goes quiet, you must try to follow up with them at least 3 times before you close the ticket. Whereas 13485 says you must try and follow up with them. It doesn't say 3 times. So if you're doing an MDSAP audit against the FDA, they will check, are you following up 3 times with complaints that aren't responding to you? So there's a lot of little bits. So there's also a document called the MDSAP audit program, audit schedule. They changed the name a couple of times, but there's a document that says for each, here are the 8 sections of MDSAP, and here are the country-specific requirements against each of them. So there's a separate document to look at on top of 13485 to prepare for an MDSAP audit.
Thank you.
So I thought I'd talk about some standards organizations as well. So you've heard me mention ISO 13485 about 5-6 times now. But these standards documents are generally drafted by volunteers. So there are hundreds, maybe thousands, probably thousands of people who work with national and international organizations to draft these standards. The International Standards Organization, ISO, and the International Electrotechnical Committee, both of them based in Switzerland, draft most of the standards that end up being relevant to medical device manufacturers. You get some other ones from ETSI, is a European electromagnetic compatibility standard set, or sorry, not electromagnetic, radio frequency communication standard set. And then there are standards for like laboratory instruments that come from the CLSI, but ISO and IEC are the most commonly internationally recognized standards. Once ISO and IEC and the international volunteers who are involved with them draft those standards, they are sent then to individual national standards agencies. So the UK has the British Standards Institute. The EU has an organization called the Centre for European Normalization, which is CEN, and CEN-ELEC, which is the portion of CEN that covers electrical related standards. And they coordinate across EU national bodies to approve things for the whole of the EU. BSI is still working with CEN and CEN-ELEC as if the UK never left the EU, which is a bit weird and a bit confusing, but they do. They're still incorporated into that pan-European framework for standards. The national standards agencies like BSI will approve those documents, but that doesn't mean that the regulators have accepted them. So in the UK, the MHRA has to do what it calls designating a standard, and that means it considers that standard as appropriate for fulfilling whatever its scope is. So ISO 13485 for your quality management system, ISO 14971 for risk management of a medical device. So the MHRA say those are acceptable. BSI say, yes, this is a good standard. And then the MHRA say this is specifically good enough for a medical device. So for example, there's a standard called BS, which is British Standard, not what else it might abbreviate for, 34971, which is related to risk management of AI or machine learning enabled medical devices. So it's guidance on ISO 14971 for AI companies. It is a British standard because the British Standards Institute have approved it, but the MHRA haven't designated it. So they haven't said, while it is intended for medical devices, the MHRA haven't said you must or you should follow this standard. This is what we recommend. So there is a whole complicated set of steps in getting a standard accepted by a regulator. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't follow those standards. It just means that they are not by default accepted. And if you're dealing with a notified body or an approved body, you'll almost certainly get asked about some random standard that you've never heard of that only applies to different products or to similar products as part of your technical file review. They will ask, why didn't you consider this standard, and this standard? And you'll be expected to answer that question to them. So it's worth doing a thorough search of any potentially relevant standards from ISO, IEC, and the national standards agencies. Any questions about standards there or standards agencies? Cool. I'll keep going. Okay. I'm going to talk as well about accreditation. So I mentioned earlier ISO 13485. Companies that make medical devices are certified to ISO 13485 by certification bodies, which means that the certification body has said, within the scope of your quality management system, you're doing the appropriate things to make or distribute or sell or whatever your operation is, the medical devices. Those certification bodies are then overseen by what are called accredited bodies. I'm sorry about all the terminology. I will get through this as quick as I can. The UK accredited body is UCAS. UCAS agrees with the certification body what they should do in your audits to certify you to ISO 13485. UCAS, which is again the UK accredited body, has agreements with accredited bodies in other countries that if UCAS have done it, if UCAS have accredited a certification body and then they've given you a certificate, organizations in these other countries will accept that certificate as equivalent to having been done in your own country. So if you go to Germany or you go to France or you go to Italy or you go to America and you have a UCAS accredited ISO 13485 certificate, they will accept that certificate because that agreement is done at a international level through an organization called the International Accreditation Forum. Some companies get caught out by being certified by certification bodies that are not accredited by a member of the International Accreditation Forum. So if you have an ISO, you might have an ISO 13485 certificate, and you may have passed that from an external auditor, and you may take it to the NHS, or you may take it to a notified body, or you may take it to a customer outside of the UK, and they may say, this is not certified by a certification body accredited by an International Accreditation Forum member, therefore you in our opinion are not certified to ISO 13485. The NHS released guidance on exactly that question. I think it was 4 months ago now, where they said we will only accept ISO certificates from UCAS accredited or equivalent organizations, and notified bodies will do the same thing, including when looking at your suppliers. So if you have a supplier and you've said, well, they're ISO 9001 or they're ISO 13485 certified and the certificate is not from a member of the International Accreditation Forum, they will say, no, they're not. You've got that wrong. There's a non-conformity. And the only way most people find out about that is that they get a non-conformity from an audit, because this is not very well publicized, which is why I'm mentioning it here.
Thanks, Daniel. I think we're ready to go for
Brill.
the section.
All right, welcome back, everyone. I hope you all had a nice, relaxing break. If anyone has any questions that came up to them over the break, just drop them in the chat, and I will crack on with the rest of the presentation. So the rest of what we're going to talk about is what to expect. If you've understood the medical device basics from one territory, what the differences tend to be in other territories. The fact is, through work through like the IMDRF, and just because at one point it was easier to copy someone else's regulations than write your own, there is a fair amount of alignment between medical device regulations internationally. So wherever you go with your product, if it is considered a medical device in that country, because that's one of the dissimilarities, you can expect to see regulatory requirements for quality management, risk management, some sort of post-market surveillance, or some way of knowing that the product is still safe and effective after it was designed and released onto the market. Some requirements around what you need to communicate to users and to patients about the medical device and its risks and its benefits. Some method of controlling the design and development process to make sure that you are creating the device you intended to and the device that patients want and need, and some method of record keeping, of keeping that information about the product clear and available, so that if something goes wrong, you or the regulator can investigate it, so that you can show that you have the evidence to support the safety and effectiveness of that product. The terminology might be different, the exact methodology might be slightly different, but broadly you will expect to see some of each of these appearing in any territory that you intend to sell a medical device in. So if we talk about the differences, the country to country or territory to territory specific differences tend to come in these areas, which I'll talk through now, but the areas tend to be related, and for those who were in my previous presentation, they tend to be related mainly to the product and the registration of the product, and less so to the quality management system. One big difference, one big area of difference between territories is the fees that are charged by the regulators. So the most expensive FDA fee is over $500,000. I don't think there is a way you could get charged that amount in the EU for a single activity, but the most expensive FDA fee goes up to $500,000. The most expensive fee from the MHRA, although there are also approved bodies in the UK, but the most expensive fee from the MHRA is something like $5,000. So the cost of registering a product and the annual costs of maintaining that registration vary from country to country. The other thing that can vary quite a bit, although there's been more and more alignment on this with the work of the IMDRF, is what qualifies as a medical device in each territory and how it's classified. So in the EU, in the UK, we have 4 classifications: so Class 1, Class 2A, Class 2B, and Class 3. Health Canada, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, or A, B, C, D. The US has 3, but what rules cause you to fall into each of those categories, and what rules cause you to be a medical device or not, those are different country to country. And I'll talk a bit about those in specific countries in the following slides. The way in which you are approved can change from country to country. So the FDA tend to do most of their own approvals, although there are third-party organizations that will gain you access to the US market for some approval mechanisms. But generally that is the model in many countries, but obviously in the UK and the EU there are approved bodies and notified bodies who do most of the approvals for medical devices that need them. For anyone who's working on software with AI incorporated into it, PCCP stands for a predetermined change control plan. It's a mechanism by which you can get pre-approval for certain changes to your AI algorithm or your software from the regulator, so you don't have to go back to them for a subsequent approval if you make significant changes to that. At the moment, only the US has a mechanism to get a predetermined change control plan. The UK and the EU are looking at it, but it's worth remembering that in a lot of countries, almost any change to an AI algorithm that's central to the functioning of a medical device will be considered a change that needs re-registration or reapproval. That is on the roadmap for the MHRA for the UK to set up a mechanism to do that. this is one that I was sort of joking about with Sam and Emily before the call, but terminology. So if you submit a document to a regulator that uses the terminology from a different territory, they will not like that. It won't be a problem, and they won't specifically give you a non-conformity for that, but it will rub them up the wrong way. So if you submit a document to the FDA that talks about your technical documentation instead of your design history file, they will feel, rationally or not, disrespected by that submission because you didn't take the time to change it to their terminology for them, and you will have a tougher time doing it. So just understanding what each regulator calls certain things can be quite helpful as well. And sometimes they will give you a non-conformity for using the wrong terminology. Each country, territory, different region that you're looking at will have different language requirements, and that applies to the user interface of your product. That applies to the labeling, the instructions for use that go with the product. The users need to be able to read it, so it needs to be in a language that they can read. Or you can use symbols to communicate some of the information as well. In terms of translating between languages, the thing that I've seen accepted most by notified bodies is translations done by translation companies that are certified to ISO 17100. This is another example of that accreditation certification question about interaction with the IAF. If you were relying on someone's ISO 17100 certification, you'd want that to be UCAS accredited or accredited by someone in the IAF. And essentially, if you are translating material, they expect it to be translated by one person and then proofread by another person, both of whom know that language well enough to do that. So if you're talking to a notified body, they will ask you for evidence of that if you've done any translation of your user interface or your instructions for use. In the EU, many, but not all, and not even most, I don't think, countries will accept English for the user interface and for some of the instructions for use if it's a professional use medical device. But if it's for what the EU calls laypersons, but people who aren't healthcare professionals, you'll probably have to translate it into the local language. But France, Spain, Italy, they all require French or Spanish or Italian, depending on what country you're selling into, translations of user information. So you can become CE marked for the EU, but if you don't have a French translation, a Spanish translation, an Italian translation, you can't access those countries until you've done that. There's also to be considered the language requirements for communication with the regulator. Most, if not all, of the notified bodies in the EU will communicate with you in English, but some regulators will not. They will require you to be able to both communicate with them in the language that they speak in their country, and in some instances translate your technical file for them. So there's that consideration before you submit something to a regulator, that you might need someone, or you might need some advice from someone who can speak the language for the regulator to even communicate with you. There's a concept in medical devices called UDI, which is a unique device identifier, which is a series of numbers or letters that uniquely identify a particular medical device. There are different requirements for that in different countries, although so there's no requirement for it in the UK yet. The US and the EU both require it, and a number of other countries have adopted requirements for it. There is getting better alignment on exactly what that looks like. But there are still a couple of times where you could do something that's compliant in the US that the EU wouldn't accept, or something in the EU that the US wouldn't accept. So it's worth checking that whatever UDI agency you're working with is accepted in all the territories that you're interested in working in. Most territories require a local representative. If you are not physically based in that country, you will need a company, an organization that is based on in that country to act on your behalf. So that's true in the UK. And obviously, if everyone's here is in the UK, then that won't be a problem. But that's true in the EU, US, you have to have someone who is within that territory. They normally have to hold a certain amount of information about the product, and you normally have to have a binding contract with them in terms of how you will communicate with them and how they will communicate with the regulator on your behalf. Each country will have its own database to register your medical device in. So the MHRA has PARD or DAWS, depending on which way you're getting into it. The US has about 50 different databases, and you register with different ones depending on the type of medical device. The EU's one is called UDAMED, and it's being slowly and gradually implemented. I think it's due to be completed in the next year or so. I mentioned earlier the concept of harmonization. Recognition is what the US call it. Designation is what the UK calls it. There's a different word in different countries, but each country will recognize different standards as meeting or not meeting their medical device regulations. And each regulator will have published guidance about how they expect you to interact with them, what requirements they have for your technical documentation, what requirements they have for your quality management system, and you're expected to absorb and implement all of that before you submit a submission to that regulator or put a product onto their market. I haven't found an easy way of doing that other than taking a fairly generic view of your own systems and management system and technical documentation as it's set up, and rather than trying to create separate documents, making them as generic as possible. So rather than calling it, for example, when I mentioned terminology earlier, don't call your document what the US call it or what the EU call it, give it a different name, and then tell them we call that document that for the EU. So it's not our technical file, it's not our 510K submission, it's our design and development documents. And by the way, here's a note to the FDA, this is our design history file, and to the EU, this is our technical documentation. But yeah, so these are the areas where you tend to see differences between, and not generally big differences, but differences between regulators. So I'm going to run through some of those that people are interested in. So the European Union approval is by a notified body, which you'll have heard that already. The EU requirements are mostly aligned with IMDRF guidance. So I don't know who did it first, the IMDRF or the EU, but EU MDR and IMDRF guidance tend to be pretty similar to each other. One of the big differences is that the EU also regulates some non-medical products as medical devices, which is what Annex 16 covers. For the EU, your approval, there's self-certification for Class 1 medical devices, or you're approved through a notified body. Each country of the EU has its own language requirements, and thankfully about 2 years ago, the European Commission put up a document that explained for each country what are the language requirements for your user interface and for your instructions for use. There's a link, if these slides can be shared afterwards, to that. Before that, you had to do it yourself. So you had to go to the German implementation of the European, of the medical device regulation and say, what does it say about using German language versus English language, which was not a fun job that week. I did that. The EU does require a UDI be present on the medical device. You do have to have an EU authorized representative. I mentioned the UDAMED database earlier. Standards are approved by CEN and CENELEC, which I talked about earlier, and I talked about harmonization, and guidance documents are published by the Medical Device Coordinating Group. I've got a few more slides about the US. So the way in which I would say the US probably has the most distinct set of qualification and classification criteria. So that most countries have 4 classes of medical device, and the US has 3. There's no distinction between in vitro diagnostics and other medical devices, whereas most countries do have different sets of rules for that. And the classification rules, there are thousands of classification rules in the US, whereas most countries have dozens, maybe less than 20. So most countries have rules for how you classify medical devices, and then you pick your class based on them. The US has categories of products, and you have to fall into one of those categories of products, or as we'll come to in a minute, make a new category. You've got different approval routes for the US, which I've got some more slides on. They allow for predetermined change control plans for AI medical devices, which can be really helpful to reduce the amount of submissions you have to make to the FDA. They will expect English language predominantly. There are specific rules for, I think it's Puerto Rico. You have to have a different language if you're selling specifically in Puerto Rico. They do have a requirement for unique device identifiers. You do have to have a US agent, and that US agent needs to be able to answer the phone to the FDA in business hours at any time they want to call you. And if they try to call your US agent and they don't answer the phone, you will be in trouble with the FDA. Which is always a fun one to remember. The main databases for the FDA are called GUDID, which is where you record your UDI numbers and your product details, and the Establishment Register, which is where you record your company as someone that supplies onto the US market. And the FDA handle recognizing standards, and the FDA also publish the guidance for the US market, and they publish a lot of guidance, which can be really useful even if you're not going to the US in establishing good practice in things like cybersecurity, or they have some very good AI guidance around the kind of things that regulators are thinking about with AI medical devices. Different ways to engage with the FDA. So I'll talk about a few of these. A Q submission is a free interaction with the FDA, which is something they brought in a little while ago. There's a whole range of different types of Q submission, but the main one that people talk about are pre-submissions. A pre-submission is a way of saying to the FDA, here is our plan. Do you like it? The FDA in their guidance are very clear that the pre-submission is not what should we do. It's we think we figured this out. Please tell us if you think we've got anything wrong. So in a pre-submission, they'll expect to see like finished, signed off versions of plans that would be part of your submission to the FDA. But it's a free route, and they are very helpful and very specific in their feedback if you present the information to them in the right way. If you try to book a pre-submission with a couple of pages of documents that are thrown together, they will reject your submission, and they will look unkindly on future submissions as well. There's also there are other types of Q submissions. So if you're doing a more advanced a PMA, which we'll come to in a minute, submission to the FDA, there's a Q submission to request a meeting after 100 days to review how the progress is going. So Q submission is the FDA sort of catch-all term for all the different free ways that you can interact with us. Pre-submission is the specific Q submission mechanism to ask questions prior to submitting an application for a medical device. A 513G, all of these numbers and letter combinations are referring to specific parts of the medical device regulations in the US. A 513G costs between $4,000 and $8,000 and lets you ask specifically, have we classified this product correctly based on, again, approved technical documentation that you're going to send to them. A 510K is a way of saying, we think our product is as good as our competitors that is already on the market. Please confirm that and allow us to put it onto your market. And it costs between $6,000 and $24,000. It's the most common way to get a product onto the US market, but you have to be what they call substantially equivalent to a product that's already on the US market. A de novo application is an application to say, we have a new product that you haven't seen yet, but we don't think it's as risky as the products as a class 3 product. Therefore, could we please have this approved as a lower risk class of product? And a PMA says either this is a new or existing product, but we think it's class 3, so can you do a very thorough review of this product, please? And that's the one that costs up to over $500,000 to get to pay for the mechanism. Any questions at that point before I run through the other territories? So I know the US and the EU are often people's focus markets after the UK or even before the UK.
There's nothing. Oh, actually, there's one. If we're considering a 510 Okay, is it enough to follow the standards of the predicate?
So if you are putting a 510K in, there are what the US call general controls and standard control. Specific controls. So your whatever product classification that you are looking at for the existing product that you are going to prove substantial equivalence to, look at the special controls that the FDA publish under that product classification, and it will tell you which standards to meet to be considered equivalent to that product. The FDA are actually really good at providing guidance on that in the product classification database. I'd also say look at other 510K submissions within that product class, because you will be able to read this, not the total submission, but the summary of the submission. So the kinds of evidence, the list of evidence that the FDA is looking for, even down to the performance of the competitor devices. So looking at those 510Ks are really helpful for writing your own. They're also really helpful for establishing what is state of the art for other territories as well. Because if you can look at exactly what 10 of your competitors said to the FDA their product can do, then you know what the state of the art on in the market is for your product.
There's no other questions in the chat at the moment.
Cool. I'll talk very briefly about Switzerland, because Switzerland is a funny one. Switzerland applies the entirety of EU MDR, except you need a Swiss representative. You need to register on SwissDomed, which is the Swiss equivalent of UDomed, and they required French, German, and Italian languages, all three of them, unless it's for a healthcare professional, and only if the healthcare professional is happy with English. And what that in practice means is, if you try to sell a product to someone and if you're selling a product in Switzerland and you don't have French, German, and Italian language versions, for every customer you sell to, you need a declaration from them that says, we are happy with just English. If one of them writes to you and says, actually, no, I want French, German, or Italian, you better get it translated pretty quickly, like within a couple of weeks. Or you may have, if they were to report that to the regulator, they would have a problem. There was a breakup between Switzerland and the EU with the new version of MDR that led to Switzerland just having very subtle differences. Canada, so their regulator is called Health Canada. Their qualification and classification criteria are very similar to the EU MDR and to the IMDRF framework. There is a MDL, which is a medical device license, and a medical device enterprise license. Establishment license, sorry. So you get a license for your product, and you get as part of that a license for you as a manufacturer. You must have MDSAP certification to sell any medical device in Canada. I know of companies that didn't get it when the deadline hit, and they were immediately delisted, and then had to spend 2 years being relisted by Canada. They require English and French, unless it's for healthcare professionals, where they will accept English. But if you sell in Quebec, they will ask you for French, and you will not sell in Quebec unless you have French. They do not yet require a UDI. You do not have to have a local representative in Canada, and they have a license listing database that you register your products with. The mechanisms and the data for approval are all quite similar to the other territories, but these are the distinctions for Canada. Australia, again, has similar qualification and classification criteria to EU MDR. Their approval routes are through the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods, and the approval can be accelerated if you're already CE marked. So if you have a CE mark for a EU MDR product in the EU, getting into Australia is a lot easier. Australia are also part of MDSAP, so while they don't require MDSAP, they will recognize an MDSAP certificate as covering your quality management system. They're in transition for UDI, so you may not need a UDI at initial registration, but you will do in the next couple of years. You require what's called a sponsor in Australia, which is a local representative for Australia, and the database is called the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods. Singapore, their medical device regulation, qualification, and classification is very similar to the UK's, which is the old version of the EU's. So Singapore haven't aligned with the EU and the IMDRF yet. They're still on a similar mechanism to the UK. They have a set of different approval routes: full, abridged, expedited, immediate, and Class A. So Class A is just a registration of a low-risk product. Immediate, expedited, and abridged are based on existing approvals from other markets. And I think expedited is for medium risk products, and then full is for the highest risk products. There is quite good and useful guidance and timelines that they stick to on the Singaporean government websites as well, which is unusual because timelines tend to go out the window sometimes with regulators. They accept English language as your user interface and for your communication with regulators. They do require a UDI. You must have, so whoever is importing a medical device, so you don't have to have a local rep, but anyone who brings it into the country and then sells it does have to be licensed, which is a slightly different way of having a local representative, because you might have multiple if you have people selling the product in Singapore. And they have a database of products and a database of what they call actors, which is manufacturers, importers, distributors of medical devices. So what I'd say in general about setting up for a new market as a medical device manufacturer, you want to make sure you understand what's going to be involved and whether it's worth going to that market. I've seen a number of companies try to enter a new market thinking, either from a sales perspective or from a regulatory perspective, this will be easy. And they've cost a lot of money to a lot of businesses not thinking this through properly, whether the benefits will outweigh the risks and the amount of time you'll spend registering. You're going to want to look at the guidance from the regulator in that territory. It can be really helpful to have a local rep that knows the regulations in that territory and will work with you on that. Many of them claim to, but it's worth checking whether they've worked with products similar to yours previously, particularly if it's AI or if it's software as a medical device. You go with someone who's used to importing syringes, they may struggle with the communication with the regulator and with supporting you with those regulations. Once you've looked at the guidance, plan to update your quality management system and what needs to be updated in your submission. You will probably already have most of the information already. Make sure that it's got the right terminology in it and it's submitted in the way that the regulator is expecting it to make that process smoother. And if you get into it, make sure you celebrate it, because if you have a regulatory team, they will be very, very excited about having completed a registration. Do congratulate them on it. They do appreciate it. The other thing to consider when looking at new markets is what the regulators might ask you with relation to your especially clinical evidence and how it applies in their country. So think about whether the use environment for your product is different. So it might be that the temperature or the humidity in that country affects if it's a physical device. If you're reliant on a high-speed internet connection and you're going to take it to somewhere that doesn't have high-speed internet connections, which you may be thinking of third world countries. I'm thinking of rural America has terrible internet connections. The FDA will ask you about how it works if you're on a dial-up modem, if it's intended for home use. Whether the hardware that the hardware that your tool is supposed to run on is common or common enough in that country in the network architecture that you can expect at a hospital. If that is still applicable within that country, the regulator will be thinking about that. Whether the standard of care in that country is significantly different. So if you had a clinical decision support software that was based entirely on NICE guidance for the UK, the FDA won't like that, because the NICE guidance and the guidance from the US institutions can be quite different. Whether the knowledge and the experience of the people using the software with this kind, or using the medical device with this kind of medical device is going to be the same. Whether the the cultural meaning and interpretation of especially symbols and colors is the same in that territory. If you have a medical device that focuses on a specific disease, is the prevalence of that disease the same in that country? Does it present in the same way? Are there genetic factors that can impact on how diseases present or how they're treated? And are the public within that territory, do they have the same perception of medicine and of medical professionals? Are they more trusting? Are they less trusting of the kind of guidance that your software might give them? These are the questions to expect from regulators around clinical evaluations. It might be that none of these are relevant to the kind of technologies you have, but this is what regulators will, especially with AI tools as well, will be thinking about when they're looking at submissions related to medical devices from another that's based on evidence from another country or another area of the world. There was also some questions about AI frameworks, and there are a few of them that I'll cover briefly. BS 30440 is a methodology for AI validation in healthcare areas. While I have read it and it sounds nice, I haven't seen many places adopting it or adopting it as a requirement within hospitals or healthcare institutions. There is a toolkit called AMLAS, which was created at the University of York, that the NHS train their clinical safety officers in, as this is good practice for how to tell whether this developer has created a safe and effective AI software tool. The UK has an AI bill that is in review in Parliament, but it has been in review in Parliament for a couple of years now, that suggests creating an AI regulation that covers all of the UK and all AI products in the UK. Quite whether it will look like what it looks like at the moment and if it'll ever be adopted, don't know. I wouldn't say that that's an up-and-coming thing to expect shortly. Comparatively, the EU have the EU AI Act, which is currently in the process of implementation. So for medical devices of Class 2A and above, it will be in effect from August of 2027. There's a link here to the standards that they intend to create and harmonize to show people how to comply with that AI Act. And there's also a link to a course that Eightfold created that explains a bit about the EU AI Act and what responsibilities people have under it. As of February of this year, everyone who supplies any sort of AI within the EU should have a mechanism to show that their staff are what they call AI literate. So have some sort of training or understanding around AI. The US's AI framework was created under the previous administration and appears to have been gutted. So outside of what the FDA has published on AI, I wouldn't say there is a clear compliance framework for AI in the US right now. That might change, but the previous one that they were working on is fairly dead. The MHRA, the FDA, and Health Canada released guidance called Good Machine Learning Practice that gives you 10 principles to apply to AI for medical devices to consider how to make them safe and effective. And if you're submitting to any regulators in those territories, I'd expect them to ask you about how you've applied good machine learning practice. Similarly, the IMDRF have their own version of the good machine learning practice, which is a different set of very similar 10 principles to apply when creating an AI medical device. Last tips before I finish, before my voice runs out more than anything, I think. Good local reps can be really useful in setting up in other countries, or good distributors who will sell your product to a tolerable local reps, because in some instances you're looking at the same organization to be local rep and distributor, and obviously you also want to sell. So if they can get you through the process, that'd be good as well. Double check IAF accreditation, especially for suppliers, for the ISO standard certifications. Don't create separate quality management systems and separate technical documents for different territories. Keep a single quality management system, keep a single set of technical documents, and then generate submissions based on those, depending on where they need to be submitted. And when you're submitting, make sure you have a document that says to the regulator, here's everything we think you were expecting of us. There's where you find it in our documentation. it will greatly speed up the review process. Every regulator has a mechanism for unannounced audits, as in turning up at whatever address you've given them, knocking on the door, and you have to let them in that day, and they have to audit you that day. The EU notified bodies, it's at minimum every 5 years that has to happen. The FDA will just turn up at random. Be prepared to be audited unannounced. They know that, especially with software companies, not everyone may be in the office that day. They will still be there that day. And you'll need to drag people out of meetings to support an audit. And it will happen eventually. And as you register in more territories, the frequency or the likelihood of it happening will increase.